The morning it began was one of those Oxford mornings when frost seems to exist not merely upon the ground, but in the air itself, suspended, glittering, still. Even the sound hesitated before it reached one's ear. I remember standing beneath the bell tower of St. Oswald's College, watching my breath mingle with the pale mist rising from the cloisters. The college was silent, as if holding its breath. It should not have been. The bells were meant to ring for matins, but that day they did not. The porter, an elderly man with a complexion like worn sandstone, told me that the frost had made the ropes stiff. He said it lightly, almost apologetically, as though frost could hush an entire tower out of respect. But there was something in the way his eyes slid toward the chapel door that made me wonder if he had rehearsed that explanation. I had not come in any official capacity. I told myself that, and yet my hands were in my pockets in the manner they always are when I'm working, even when I claim not to be. I'd heard of the organist's death the week before, Dr. Peter Wainwright, fallen from the tower steps before dawn, discovered by a student on his way to early prayers. It had been called an accident by those who preferred tidy endings. I had been among them until I received a note from an old acquaintance in the college choir, who wrote only that the bells refused to ring the morning he fell. Perhaps they knew. There is a kind of superstition one absorbs in Oxford without ever admitting it. Bells that refuse to sound, clocks that strike 13, ivy that grows against the grain, each holds a private warning. I've always distrusted coincidence. It is too convenient a refuge for the lazy-minded. I walked into the chapel, where the frost had crept even to the marble floor. The air smelt of wax and age. Rows of hymn books waited in neat obedience. Someone had left a pew candle half-melted, its wax folded like the hem of an old letter. I touched it without knowing why, and the cold passed through my fingers as if through paper. From the gallery above, I heard the faint scuff of movement of a broom, perhaps, or a shoe deliberately light. I called out that the place looked none the worse for tragedy. The voice that replied was thin and precise, that would depend on one's definition of tragedy. It was the widow, Mrs. Wainwright. She had come, she said, to collect the last of her husband's sheet music. She did not look like a woman collecting relics. Her composure was deliberate, the kind cultivated by those who have already wept too soon and now find it inconvenient to do so again. We talked in low tones beneath the organ pipes. She said her husband had been unwell, distracted, convinced he had made some discovery in a forgotten score. I asked what kind. She hesitated, a musical cipher, perhaps, hidden in an old hymn. She almost smiled at the absurdity of it, though her eyes did not. I asked if he had enemies. She said, only those who envied his hearing. When she left, a single page slipped from her folder. I meant to call after her, but curiosity is a quicker instinct than courtesy. The page was covered in notations I could not read, though a phrase in the margin stood clear enough. The frost. The frost remembered the bell that did not toll. I folded it carefully into my coat and stood again beneath the tower. A drip of thaw fell upon my collar, startling in the quiet. Somewhere high above, the rope stirred, groaning faintly against the wheel. It was then I noticed that the frost on the lowest bell was patterned unevenly, as if a hand had pressed against the metal and left a mark that would not quite melt. That evening, I told Lewis that the case of the silent bell was none of our concern. Yet I found myself awake at 2 a.m., tracing that phrase across the page in the lamplight. The frost, the frost. There are some silences that do not happen by chance. Lewis brought me the coroner's report in that apologetic way of his, as if each page might bruise me personally. I pretended to read it with detachment, though I had already absorbed its essence in the single phrase written near the top, death by misadventure. Such words always seemed to me an evasion, a bureaucratic shrug dressed as mercy. The report mentioned alcohol at a modest level, enough to soften the judgment of a careful man, but not enough to send him tumbling to his death. The steps of the bell tower were slick that morning, the frost having crusted each stone edge with deceptive beauty. The porter had said as much, yet something about the trajectory, a clean fall, straight as a plumb line, refused to feel accidental. I sat at my desk long after Lewis had gone, reading a passage from Dawn that had been tucked into the report by some anonymous hand never sent to know for whom the bell tolls it tolls for thee. Perhaps a morbid clerk's joke, or perhaps someone wanted me to think about bells. By late afternoon I found myself again walking the quadrangle of St. Oswald's. The air smelt faintly of damp wool and tobacco. A group of students passed, laughing in the brittle way youth often laughs, in proximity to death. The porter, Evans, was leaning against his lodge door, polishing the brass handle for the third time that hour. He nodded as if expecting me. I told him I was only there to return something, a page of Wainwright's manuscript I'd found in the chapel. He said nothing for a moment, then muttered that the doctor had been writing late the night he died. Said he'd heard the organ through the floorboards until just before dawn, though the clock in the porter's lodge had stopped at 3. I asked why. He said frost again. Frost seems to answer all questions in Oxford when truth is inconvenient. Inside the organ loft, dust floated like faded incense. The instrument stood silent, its keys yellowed at the edges like old teeth. I touched one. It yielded a low sigh, a note so deep I felt it rather than heard it. Something in that vibration reached backward to the moment Wainwright's hands must have left the keyboard for the final time. I imagined him alone, his candle guttering, his face tilted toward the bell tower window, where dawn was just a rumor. Margaret Wainwright had mentioned that her husband believed he had found a cipher in a hymn. I searched through the music strewn across the desk pages written in an elegant, almost obsessive hand. Latin annotations lined the margins. Yet in one corner, a smudge of ink had been deliberately drawn across a phrase, not by error, but intent. Beneath the smudge I could just discern the faint outline of letters, Toll the Frost. The same curious juxtaposition of sound and weather that had begun to haunt this investigation. Lewis arrived with the weary expression of a man who knows he will be cold for the rest of the day. He told me that the widow had inherited little, save for a collection of rare hymnals and a modest pension. No sign of financial motive. I asked him whether Wainwright had been a drinker. Lewis hesitated, then said he'd spoken to the college barman, who remembered the organist's habit of ordering brandy and leaving half of it untouched, as if the gesture itself were enough to quiet something inside him. When Lewis left, I stayed a while longer. From the tower above came a faint creak, the settling of ancient beams. I looked up and noticed a small dark shape at the edge of the parapet. A bird, frozen mid-step, wings crusted with frost. For a moment it seemed to me that the creature had paused to look down, as Wainwright might have done. There was, I thought, a strange kinship between curiosity and fatality. Both compel one to lean just a little too far forward. That night, as I wrote my notes, I found myself circling back to that phrase in the margin. Toll the frost. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift. Perhaps it was not a command, but an instruction or a key. The sort a musician leaves for the next player, so that the melody may begin again, precisely where the silence started. It was Lewis who suggested we attend Evensong. He said it would give us a sense of the place, the atmosphere, the people who had known Wainwright best. He didn't use the word ghosts, though that's what he meant. Oxford's chapels are never more alive than when haunted. The day had folded into that thin, blue twilight particular to December, a light that seems to remember summer only out of politeness. The air in St. Oswald's chapel carried a faint metallic tang, the residue of incense and cold iron. The choir assembled in quiet precision, Boys with pale faces like folded pages, dons in their academic robes rustling faintly as they took their seats. The organ remained silent, its pipes glinting above us like muted trumpets. The choir began without accompaniment by an ancient motet whose harmonies had been meant, perhaps, for warmer air. Their voices rose through the nave in uncertain purity, the kind that trembles on the edge of doubt. Lewis shifted beside me, as if wondering whether reverence was the proper response to discomfort. I found myself thinking of Wainwright, his hands on the keys, the invisible grammar of his music. It occurred to me that the silence of the organ was not merely absence, but protest. After the service, I met Margaret Wainwright again beneath the great brass lectern shaped like an eagle. She greeted me with that same deliberate poise of a woman who has trained herself not to be startled by questions. She asked if I had found what I was looking for in her husband's study. I told her I wasn't sure yet what I was looking for. She said that made two of us. Her eyes were of that English grey which seems to absorb rather than reflect light. She spoke of Peter with the weary affection of one who had long ceased to understand the man she had once admired. He had been secretive, she said, but not cruel. The kind of man who would rather be misunderstood than pitied. I thought she might have been speaking of herself. The choir master joined us, Dr. Ashby, all nervous gestures and darting glances. He thanked her for attending, though his voice carried a tremor that was not quite respected. When he turned to me, he said he hoped the police were not planning to make a spectacle of the college. I told him Oxford rarely needed help creating spectacles. That silenced him. He excused himself to tend to the boys. One of them, Simon Lang, a tenor with hair the color of overbrewed tea, lingered near the pews. He was staring up at the organ loft, his hands clasped too tightly. I asked if he had sung for Dr. Wainwright often. He said yes, but his tone was more confession than answer. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the doctor had changed recently, distracted, sometimes angry, sometimes sad. He used to speak of frost as if it were a person. Then he stopped speaking altogether. The boy looked at me, searching my face for something I couldn't give. Outside, the college quadrangle lay beneath a thin veil of mist. Margaret walked with me as far as the gate. She said her husband had been writing a new piece before he died, a hymn for Advent, something about silence and forgiveness. She didn't know where he kept the final draft. She had asked Dr. Ashby, but he claimed never to have seen it. I told her I would look. She hesitated, then said she dreamed last night of the bells ringing, though she knew they hadn't. Dreams, she added, can be so inconsiderate. When she left, I stood a while by the porter's lodge, listening to the faint echo of the choir boys' laughter inside the cloisters. Somewhere above, a pigeon flapped from the tower, dislodging a thin crust of frost that fell like ash. I thought of Wainwright's phrase again, remembering the bell that did not toll. It had begun to feel less like poetry and more like instruction. It had been locked since the morning they found him, or so the porter assured us, though in Oxford, locked doors are more a gesture than a guarantee. Lewis and I waited while the key turned reluctantly in the old brass lock. The sound it made was oddly ceremonial, like the clearing of a throat before confession. The room smelled of polish, dust, and something faint, the ghost of brandy perhaps, or the trace of someone who had lingered too long. The piano dominated the space, a heavy Bechstein, its black lacquer dulled by fingerprints that should not have been there. I stood by the instrument while Lewis, ever dutiful, opened the curtains to let in the afternoon's pale light. The frost outside pressed against the glass like an uninvited spectator. There was a manuscript lying open on the music stand. A hymn, half finished, the ink still dense enough to have been written within days of his death. The handwriting slanted with a precision that spoke of control, except for the final line, where the pen had hesitated, leaving a mark like the pause before regret. In the margin, the same phrase appeared again, though faintly, the frost, the frost. Lewis knelt by the piano bench, brushing his hand along the carpet. A faint impression of the heel of a shoe, smaller than a man's, lingered in the nap. He asked whether Mrs. Wainwright had been here since her death. I said she had not. The porter had changed the locks himself. He looked at me as if that might mean something. It did. The lock had not been forced, yet something in this room felt intruded upon. A single candlestick stood by the window, its wax pooled unevenly. I touched it, and the wick had been trimmed recently. I asked Lewis whether candles needed trimming after death. He smiled thinly, not sure if it was a question. In the corner, a small table held a decanter half full of amber liquid. I raised it to the light. Not dusted. Someone had drunk from it since the frost. The scent was unmistakable cognac. Expensive, carefully rationed. Lewis scribbled in his notebook that the deceased was said to abstain. I wondered aloud whether abstinence ever survives solitude. On a shelf above the desk sat an assortment of hymnals and musical histories. Their spines were neat, but one volume, the Canticles of Byrd and Gibbons, was out of alignment. I drew it down. Inside, the front cover bore an inscription, "To P.W., who hears what others cannot." Beneath it, a faint stain brandy, perhaps, or something darker. Between the pages lay a torn fragment of parchment, folded once and smoothed again by anxious fingers. It read, "For he shall tell the truth at dawn." Lewis frowned, thinking it a line of scripture. I said it wasn't. The rhythm was wrong. Too deliberate. A message, perhaps, or part of Wainwright's cipher. He asked whether I believed in coded hymns. I said I believed in the vanity of men who hide meaning where it need not be found. We examined the windows locked from the inside, though the latch was newer than the frame, its screws bright against the aged wood. The repair had been recent. A draught found its way through the edges regardless, carrying the smell of wet stone. Oxford, even in daylight, contrives to feel nocturnal. Lewis stood by the door, his breath visible in the dimming air. He said the room felt colder than the rest of the building. I told him it wasn't the room. It was the absence of sound. Once, this place must have been alive with chords, the delicate quarrel of harmony and dissonance. Now it was a museum of silence. Before we left, I pressed one of the piano keys, middle C. The note rang out flat, distorted, as though the string had been deliberately loosened. Not broken, not worn, but slackened, a silent act of control. Someone had wanted the sound imperfect. That night, in my flat, I opened the parchment again and stared at its single line until the words blurred. "For he shall toll the truth at dawn." I underlined the word toll. It was not a metaphor, it was instruction. I have never liked committee rooms. They possess a particular chill, not of temperature, but of temperament, the faint odor of self-importance mingled with furniture polish. St. Oswald's had one such room, high-ceilinged and gloomily proud, where portraits of past fellows stared down as if still moderating debate. That afternoon, the vote for the new fellowship was to be held. I had no right to attend, of course, but curiosity often outruns propriety. Lewis had made inquiries earlier in the day. The short list of candidates contained only 2 names, Dr. Caroline Ashby and a younger historian whose chief distinction was enthusiasm. Wainwright had once been on the same committee. His death had postponed the election, though not evidently the politics that surrounded it. Oxford rarely buries its intrigues with its dead. I sat in the college library, waiting for the fellows to emerge. The rain had begun again, a fine, relentless drizzle that blurred the quadrangle beyond the window. The librarian, Priest, moved quietly among the shelves, his shoes whispering against the flagstones. I asked whether Dr. Wainwright had spent much time there before his death. He said yes. Always at the same desk, always reading the same volume of an anthology of metaphysical poets. He smiled faintly and added that the book had gone missing the morning after the funeral. He assumed it was sentiment. I thought otherwise. At 4 o'clock, the committee dispersed. Caroline Ashby was the first to appear, her robe gathered tightly, her hair pinned with careless precision. She saw me and hesitated only a second before walking over. She said I had developed a habit of turning up in places I didn't belong. I replied that Oxford was full of such people. She laughed without warmth. She spoke of the vote close, though she would not say in whose favor. I asked whether Wainwright had supported her before his death. She said he had, once. But that changed, she added, when he discovered that loyalty in Oxford is often a temporary arrangement. Her tone was brittle, her words measured like notes struck carefully on a faulty instrument. As she spoke, I noticed her hands were elegant, unadorned, but her right thumb bore a small burn mark, round and pale, the kind left by a candle's edge. It might have meant nothing. Still, I remembered the candle in Wainwright's music room, its wick trimmed long after his death. I asked her whether she had ever visited his rooms after that night. She denied it too quickly, and then smiled as though she had merely misunderstood the question. Lewis arrived, his coat dark with rain. He told me the vote had gone to Ashby by a narrow margin. The master had insisted on tradition, the announcement to be made beneath the bell tower, though the bells themselves remained silent out of respect for the deceased. I thought it a strange kind of honor, silence used to commemorate silence. When the announcement ended, the small crowd dispersed into polite conversation. Caroline stood alone near the chapel gate. I joined her. She said Peter Wainwright had been a difficult man, too proud, too clever, too convinced that music revealed character. He once told her, she said, that every soul carries its own dissonance and that hers was a minor. I told her a minor could be beautiful. She said, perhaps, but it always resolves in sadness. Later, walking back through the drizzle, I noticed a poster pinned to the notice board near the porter's lodge, a schedule for the Advent service Wainwright had been preparing before his death. Beneath the printed text, in another hand, was written the Frost Hymn, to be performed upon the fellowship announcement. Someone had planned for the bell to sound that day, not remain mute. Inside my pocket, the torn parchment from his room. For he shall toll the truth at dawn seemed suddenly heavier. Dawn, after all, is not a time of day in Oxford. It is the single moment when illusion gives way to light, and every lie begins to look like honesty. The porter brought it to me as though it were a relic carefully, reverently, as if the contents might hum with whatever remained of the dead man's intentions. The envelope was cream, thick, faintly scented with varnish. Its edges had curled with damp, though the seal was unbroken. Addressed simply to Dr. Peter Wainwright, St. Oswald's College. No sender, only the faint watermark of the college library embossed in the paper. Lewis stood beside me while I slit it open. The air in the porter's lodge was close, smelling faintly of paraffin and wet wool. The rain had begun again, that steady Oxford drizzle that makes every hour seem like twilight. Inside the envelope lay a single folded sheet, not typed, not signed, the handwriting small and deliberate. You will not play again once the frost comes. Lewis read it twice, frowned, and said it sounded like a threat. I told him threats seldom announce themselves so politely. He asked if I thought it had anything to do with the death. I said that everything did, eventually. We went to the library. It was nearly empty, save for Mr. Preece, the librarian, who greeted us with the exaggerated civility of a man accustomed to secrecy. I showed him the envelope. He turned it in his hands, studying the watermark as if consulting a witness reluctant to speak. He said that stationery was reserved for senior fellows, not students. I asked how many of them were women. He paused, then said only one, Dr. Caroline Ashby. He offered tea, which I declined. The cup he poured for himself trembled slightly as he lifted it, and a drop stained the open register on his desk. I noticed the page, Borrowers, December 3rd. Beside Wainwright's name was a title, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Returned, it said, the day before his death. Outside, Lewis muttered that the librarian's hands were shaking. I told him that guilt has many causes, and caffeine was one of them. Back in my office, I spread the letter on the desk beneath the lamplight. The ink was faintly smudged near the word frost, as though written by a hand unsteady from cold or fear. I tried to recall whether Wainwright's window had been open the night he died. Lewis said the porter found it shut tight, yet the frost had crept along the inner panes. A contradiction, like so much else in this case. I took up my crossword, hoping distraction might lead to clarity. The clue that caught me was frozen truth beneath the toll. 6. The answer arrived before the pencil touched the page. Belfry. Sometimes, coincidence is less accident than invitation. The following morning, I walked back to St. Oswald's. The frost had returned, thin and brittle, crackling underfoot. Margaret Wainwright stood by the chapel, her hands clasped around a small bundle of papers. She said she had found them among her husband's things notes for the Advent service. She handed them to me, and our fingers brushed her skin as if it were colder than the air. Among the pages, one stood apart a draft of a sermon. The ink was darker, newer. It spoke of the silence of bells that should ring but do not, of music that hides its own confession. I asked her whether she recognized the handwriting. She said it was his, but with hesitation. I knew then that hesitation is often an admission in disguise. Before she left, she asked if I believed the frost had meaning. I told her everything in Oxford has meaning. The problem is deciding which to believe. She smiled, faintly, and said that Peter always believed frost was a kind of forgiveness, brief, fragile, and gone by noon. That evening I examined the envelope once more. Beneath the flap, invisible unless tilted toward the light, a faint fingerprint smudged, narrow, unmistakably feminine. Not proof, merely possibility. I placed it beside the hymn manuscript and the parchment scrap. 3 fragments of a sentence still waiting to be read. Outside, the bells of another college began to ring for Compline. St. Oswald's remained silent. In Oxford, silence is never neutral. It either mourns or warns. I had yet to decide which. It was Lewis who found it, though he didn't know what he was holding when he did. A small sepia photograph, curled slightly at the edges, tucked between the pages of a forgotten college archive. 4 people stood before the chapel steps. Wainwright, Caroline Ashby, a young tenor I recognized as Simon Lang, and a woman whose name the past had almost erased. Margaret Wainwright, though younger by years and expression. The light caught her in such a way that her face seemed half in shadow, as though already retreating from memory. Lewis handed it to me without comment. He had learned by then that silence was a kind of courtesy between us. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Before the frost." It might have been a date or a warning. I took the photograph to my office and placed it under the lamp. The faces stared back with that peculiar intimacy photograph possessing the illusion of motion stilled forever. Wainwright stood with one hand on the woman's shoulder, though his eyes, curiously, were not on her, but on the tower beyond. The man was aware, perhaps, that he was being watched by something larger than the camera. Caroline Ashby, by contrast, faced the lens directly, a faint smile suggesting the victory of composure over emotion. I rang the Bodleian archivist to ask about the photograph's provenance. She said it had been part of a small exhibition, Music and Memory, St. Oswald's, 1950-1980. The catalogue listed it as the Choir Fellowship, 1974. Wainwright would have been newly appointed then, Margaret not yet his wife. The archivist mentioned, almost casually, that the exhibition had been held the night before his death. I asked if the photograph had been displayed. She said yes. though someone had removed it before the event closed. I walked to the exhibition room myself. It was empty now, the air smelling of cardboard and polish. The hooks along the walls left pale rectangles where pictures had hung. I could imagine the photograph there of Margaret's shadowed face beneath the heading Harmony and Dissonance. The words struck me as too apt to be accidental. When I returned to St. Oswald's, Margaret was standing beneath the bell tower, gazing upward into the grey. She seemed unsurprised to see me, as though my arrival had been long rehearsed. I told her we'd found the photograph. She asked if she looked young in it. I said she looked as though she hadn't yet decided who she would become. That drew the faintest smile. She said Peter had hated that picture. He told her once that it was not a moment, but a mistake. I asked what kind. She hesitated. Then she said it was taken after a rehearsal, the day Caroline Ashby had been denied her fellowship for the first time. Peter believed he'd been blamed. She said he became a man who lived among silences after that. I told her that some men prefer silence because it's the only conversation they can control. As we stood there, a faint chime drifted from another college across the river. Margaret said she had come that morning to listen, to see if the frost had lifted from the bells. I asked whether she believed the sound could be frozen. She said everything could be, given time. Back in my room, I studied the photograph once more. Something had changed in my perception of it. The woman's eyes, which I had taken for reflection of light, were not light at all, but faint scratches. Deliberate, shallow cuts through the surface. A small act of destruction disguised as age. I fetched a magnifying glass. The scratches were letters, crudely carved, no truth in frost. I sat for a long time, the photograph beside the unopened letter and the hymn manuscript. 3 fragments again, 3 forms of silence written, composed, and now captured in light. Somewhere among them, I suspected, was not guilt but remorse. Oxford is built upon the difference. It was the choir boy who came forward first. Simon Lang. His face held that particular earnestness young men wear when they've mistaken guilt for courage. He asked to speak privately, though in Oxford such privacy usually lasts only as long as it takes for word to reach the master's secretary. He told me he had seen Dr. Wainwright the night he died. Not merely seen spoken to him, argued even on the steps of the bell tower. He said they'd quarreled about a hymn, one that the organist refused to include in the Advent service. The boy's voice wavered when he said it had been cold, bitterly so, and that frost had gathered on the stone beneath their feet. He claimed Wainwright slipped during the argument, fell backwards without a sound. He ran, he said, terrified. It had been an accident. Lewis believed him, or wanted to. I did not. Not because the story was implausible, but because it was too complete. In Oxford, truth rarely presents itself in neat paragraphs. I asked the boy what time this supposed argument had taken place. He hesitated, then said around 6 in the morning. I asked if the bells had rung that hour. He said they hadn't. That detail, I noted, was true, but he had forgotten something more telling about the frost. That particular morning, the frost had sealed the steps in a skin of ice. Even the porter, Evans, had said the stairs were impassable until nearly 9. So how had Simon Lang climbed them without leaving so much as a mark? And why had he waited a week to tell the tale? The answer, I suspected, was not courage, but instruction. Someone had told him what to say. I walked back to the tower that afternoon. The frost had lifted by then, though the stone still held its memory. Standing there, I could see how narrow the parapet was, how easily a man might fall. Yet the rail, repaired since the death, told another story. The original screws had been stripped clean, as though removed and replaced. An accident, yes, but one arranged by careful hands. Lewis joined me, his breath visible in the thin air. He said he'd spoken again to the widow. She'd received a letter that morning, unsigned, advising her to stop reopening the past. The phrase struck me as reopening the past as the kind only academics or murderers use. I asked where the letter had been posted. Lewis said the Oxford Central Office, 2 nights ago. Carolyn Ashby, I remembered, had returned from a conference that same evening. Coincidence again, or choreography? We went to her room. She was preparing for a recital, her desk littered with mocked-up scores. She seemed untroubled by our visit, though she asked whether we'd found the choir boy's confession satisfying. I told her that confessions too easily given often conceal someone else's fear. She smiled that academic smile designed to register amusement without warmth. She said Simon was impressionable, devoted to Wainwright even after death. He had seen what he needed to see to free himself of it. Then she turned back to her music, dismissing us with the faintest inclination of her head. Outside her room, Lewis asked if I thought she was lying. I told him lying was too crude a word. People in Oxford mislead themselves first, and others merely as an afterthought. He asked what I made of the choir boy's story. I said it reminded me of the bells that did not ring. A false toll, perfectly timed to convince us something sacred had occurred, when in truth it was only silence. That night, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. Across the street, frost gathered again on the roof tiles, glowing faintly in the lamplight. I thought of Simon Lang, the trembling sincerity in his voice. He had described the fall so precisely, the posture, the angle, the final stillness, details no one could know unless they'd seen the body later, under different circumstances. Someone had rehearsed him, fed him phrases drawn from the coroner's report. The frost, I thought, was not the only thing repeating itself. Oxford had developed its own way of covering tracks through ritual, through music, through the convenient fictions of confession. Somewhere in that silence, beneath the sound that never was, lay the truth waiting for a morning. It was the smudge that brought me back to the music room. A smear of ink hardly worth noticing, yet it had begun to trouble me more than any confession. I'd remembered the way the letters bent beneath it, not carelessly blurred, but deliberately concealed. Secrets, I've learned, do not fade. They are always erased with intent. The college was deserted that night. A drizzle had turned the flagstones slick, and the only light came from the chapel's high window, where the faint gleam of the organ pipes shimmered like a half-remembered prayer. I let myself in with the key Lewis had borrowed from the porter. The air was thick with cold and disuse. Dust clung to the polished wood, and the faint scent of candle grease lingered as though someone had left in haste, long after they should have gone. The manuscript waited on the stand exactly as before. I unfolded it beneath my torch, the page trembling slightly in the draught. The Latin marginalia was still there, elegant, pedantic, unhelpful, but the smudged passage near the bottom caught the light differently. I took out a small ultraviolet lamp borrowed from forensics, an instrument Oxford has never fully approved of, preferring mystery to revelation. Under the faint violet glow, the ink changed color, revealing the faint tracery of letters beneath the blur, an acrostic of the first letter of each line forming a word. Margaret. It was not an accident. The word had been written purposefully, embedded like a signature, hidden in plain sight. The hymn that bore it was one of forgiveness, a piece meant for Advent, the season of waiting. A message from a dead man, addressed to his wife. I heard the door open behind me. Margaret Wainwright stood there, her hands clasped at her waist, her face pale against the darkness. She asked, very quietly, if I had found what I came for. I told her that it depended on what she had meant for me to find. She stepped forward, eyes on the manuscript. She said Peter had loved secrets. He believed that truth required concealment, as if honesty were something to be earned. He'd discovered her forgery, she said, a musical fraud she'd committed years earlier, when she'd copied a rare Renaissance hymn and passed it off as her own scholarly reconstruction. It had made her reputation. Without it, there would have been no fellowship, no invitations, no husband. Peter, she said, had promised to keep her secret. But something in him changed. The night before he died, he told her he planned to reveal everything at the Advent service, that the hymn would be performed with the missing line restored and her name exposed in every note. She paused then, and I saw the faint tremor in her hand, as though the memory itself were cold. I asked if she'd gone to the tower that night. She said yes, but not to stop him, to forgive him. He was already drunk, she said, already half gone from the world. The frost had turned the steps treacherous. He'd slipped as she reached for him. She said she never screamed, only listened. The bells did not ring. They never did. Lewis arrived at the door, his boots echoing softly on the flagstones. He looked from her to me and back again, as though waiting for instruction. I told him nothing. There are truths, I've found, that exist only in the space between two silences, the one before confession and the one after. When she left, I turned back to the manuscript. Beneath the acrostic, another faint line emerged, almost invisible beneath the musical staves. The frost forgives no hand that trembles. A line of poetry or an accusation, perhaps both. I replaced the page exactly as I'd found it, extinguished the lamp, and closed the door behind me. Outside, the night had cleared. The bells of another college struck midnight, their tones thin but certain, carrying through the damp air like a truth too proud to stay buried. I remember that morning as though the air itself resisted memory. The frost had returned, sharper now, more deliberate, as if nature wished to preserve the scene in glass. St. Oswald lay silent beneath it, the lawns white with delicate geometry, the tower rhymed with light. I had been awake since before dawn, restless, the manuscript still on my desk, its ink fading to the color of regret. By the time the first chime was due, I was already walking through the quadrangle, my breath a pale thread behind me. Lewis met me by the porter's lodge, his collar turned up, his expression wary. He said the master wanted the tower locked until the thaw, for safety. I told him safety was a fiction Oxford invented to postpone truth. He sighed, as he always did when my reasoning drifted toward philosophy, and handed me the key. The steps were narrow, crusted with frost that gleamed like mica. My gloved hand slid along the railing, and I thought of Wainwright's last ascent, whether he had climbed in anger or in faith. Each landing felt colder than the one before, as if I were ascending not a tower, but a memory. Near the top, the air-thinned sound dissolved into breath. Then the bell chamber was vast, hollow, waiting. The bells stood silent in their timber frames. The largest, St. Oswald's bell, bore a dull sheen of ice along its rim. I traced it with my gloved hand and felt a strange tackiness beneath the frost. Not ice, not residue, but wax. Pale, translucent, wedged deep between clapper and bell. Whoever had placed it there had meant for the bell to be mute. Silence had not been an accident. It had been designed. Lewis joined me, his boots echoing faintly. He asked if it proved anything. I told him it proved everything and nothing, which was the same thing in Oxford. He looked at the wax, frowned, and said it could have been there for months. I said frost forgets, but wax remembers. It had been pressed by a hand that trembled, a woman's perhaps, or a guilty man's. I leaned against the parapet and looked out over the quadrangle. The mist was lifting now, thin and luminous. From this height, the college looked almost pure, its secrets disguised by symmetry. I thought of Margaret Wainwright, her quiet poise, her confession not quite a confession, of Caroline Ashby, whose hands bore the small burn of a candle, whose ambition was both her sin and her solace, of Simon Lang, repeating a story rehearsed for him by someone too afraid to speak it themselves. Each had rung a different note in the same melody of deceit. Lewis was saying something about evidence, about statements, but his words fell away. A sound rose beneath us, faint but undeniable, the low hum of a bell string freeing itself. One chime, imperfect but alive, drifted into the cold air. The wax had given way. The frost had melted enough to let the clapper move. It struck once, softly, a toll, no one in particular. Yet it felt like an apology. I left Lewis there, staring up into the rafters. Back on the quad, the air smelled faintly of wet stone and something cleaner, renewal perhaps, or surrender. Margaret was waiting by the chapel gate, her face pale beneath her scarf. She asked if the bells would ever ring again. I told her they just had. She looked toward the tower and whispered that Peter had always said frost was a kind of mercy, that it preserves what it cannot forgive. Later in my room I wrote my report. It was brief, factual, almost careless. I wrote that Dr. Peter Wainwright died by misadventure, though I knew that word to be a lie. Deaths in Oxford are seldom accidental. They're composed, like music, from motives too intricate for law. When I finished, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The first light touched the spires, gilding the frost into brilliance. I thought of the single bell tone that had broken the silence and wondered whether truth, like sound, only matters when it refuses to stay buried. Even frost, I murmured to the glass, remembers warmth once it's gone.